a city designed to look forward, built on a colonial frontier. Asmara enters history not as an organic metropolis, but as an answer to a problem the Italian colonial state had not yet solved: where power should sit, and how it should look, in a territory still being claimed. From the beginning, the city is less a response to population than a projection of intent, an attempt to stabilize authority through spatial design before political control is fully secured. At the end of the 19th century, Italy's presence in what it would soon call Eritrea was fragile and improvised. The coastal port of Massawa had served as the first administrative hub, tied to the Red Sea and imperial supply lines, but Massawa was hot, humid, and exposed. Disease traveled easily through the lowlands, and the climate discouraged permanent European settlement. Cholera outbreaks and high mortality among Italian officials reinforced the sense that the coast was unsuitable for long-term rule. For a colonial project that imagined itself as lasting, this mattered. Authority needed a healthier climate, a controllable terrain, and distance from the coast's instability. Asmara, perched in the central highlands, offered these advantages. It sat at altitude, cooler and drier, connected by caravan routes but not yet fixed into a dense urban fabric. When Italy formally declared Eritrea a colony in 1890, the choice of Asmara as the administrative centre followed a logic common to European empires: govern from a place that could be reshaped. What existed on the ground, villages, farms, paths, social boundaries, was treated not as a city, but as raw material to be reorganized. Early Italian planning did not emerge from local demand or gradual growth. It arrived through surveys, maps, and ordinances produced by military engineers and administrators. Grids were drawn where fields had been. Roads were aligned to military and bureaucratic needs rather than older patterns of movement. From the beginning, urban order was imposed rather than negotiated. Asmara was imagined less as a settlement and more as a diagram, an abstract space in which power could be rendered visible, legible, and repeatable. This planning was never neutral. Racial zoning was embedded early, separating European residential quarters from areas designated for the indigenous population. These divisions were justified in administrative language: health, sanitation, order, but their effect was social and political. Access to paved roads, clean water, and public services followed racial and status lines. The city's layout became a daily lesson in hierarchy, reinforced not by speeches but by streets, distances, and restrictions on movement. Yet in these early decades, Asmara remained modest. Buildings were low and functional, infrastructure expanded slowly, constrained by budget, labor, and Italy's limited imperial reach. The city was a capital in name more than in scale. Its importance lay not in what it was, but in what it was intended to become: a stable base from which Italian authority could radiate inland, even if that authority was still contested beyond the city's edges. The transformation accelerated after Italy's defeat at Adwa in 1896, a shock that reshaped imperial thinking. The loss forced Italy to reconsider how it projected power in Africa. Administration, infrastructure, and symbolism gained renewed importance as substitutes for military prestige. Asmara, already selected as the capital, became the site where this recalibration could be tested. Roads improved, government buildings multiplied, the city's footprint expanded outward, still carefully zoned, still planned from above. Italian settlers arrived in small numbers at first: officials, soldiers, technicians. Their presence reinforced the separation between rulers and ruled, but also increased demand for housing, services, and leisure spaces. Asmara began to take shape as a colonial town, with cafes, offices, workshops, and administrative compounds. None of this was accidental. Each addition followed regulations designed to maintain control, surveillance, and visibility. For Eritreans living and working in the growing city, this transformation brought ambivalence. Construction created employment, both waged and coerced. Urban proximity offered access to new markets and skills, but it also imposed restrictions on where one could live, how one could move, and which parts of the city were off-limits. Asmara's growth did not erase older social structures, it pressed them into a new, unequal urban frame. By the early 1930s, the foundations were in place. The city had roads capable of expansion, administrative authority firmly rooted in the highlands, and a planning regime accustomed to reshaping space without consultation. What it lacked was spectacle. The capital existed, but it did not yet embody the grand vision that Italian fascism would soon demand of its empire. That demand arrived abruptly with the rise of Mussolini and the turn toward aggressive imperial expansion. In Rome, architecture and urbanism were being reimagined as tools of ideology. ways to make power concrete, modern, and unavoidable. In Asmara, planners and officials recognized an opportunity. Here was a city without centuries of built resistance, a capital already invented rather than inherited. Modernity, once incremental, was about to arrive at speed, and when it did, it would remake Asmara, not just as an administrative center, but as a showcase built quickly, built deliberately, and built on foundations laid long before the world was watching. Why did a colonial city become a laboratory for European modernism? The answer lies less in taste than in timing. By the mid-1930s, Asmara stood at a peculiar intersection, a capital already planned from above, lightly built, and politically peripheral enough to invite experimentation. Its distance from Italy insulated architects from conservative opposition and historical preservation debates. What might have been contested in Rome could be realized quickly in Eritrea. When Fascist Italy turned toward empire with renewed urgency, the city offered something rare: space, speed, and freedom from scrutiny at home. The catalyst was Italy's war against Ethiopia in 1935. The campaign transformed Eritrea from a quiet colony into a logistical rear area almost overnight. Roads were widened to carry convoys, depots expanded, airfields, workshops, and offices multiplied. Asmara's population surged as soldiers, administrators, engineers, and settlers arrived in waves. What had been a modest Highland capital was suddenly expected to perform as a modern imperial city, capable of projecting confidence, efficiency, and inevitability to those passing through it. For the fascist regime, architecture was not decoration, it was declaration. In Italy, modernism had become entangled with politics. Clean lines, rational forms, and industrial materials presented as evidence of national vitality and discipline. In the colonies, this aesthetic carried additional weight. Buildings were meant to announce that Italian rule was not a temporary occupation, but a civilizational upgrade. Concrete replaced improvisation, planning accelerated, time itself seemed compressed, as though modernity could be delivered on schedule. Asmara's architects operated with unusual latitude. Far from Rome's conservative critics and historical constraints, they could build boldly and quickly. Styles overlapped and competed: Rationalism with its geometric restraint, Futurism with its fascination for speed and machines, and Streamlined modernism adapted to climate and function. There was no single blueprint. Instead, the city became a dense urban experiment carried out at scale, where architectural ideas were tested through construction rather than debate. Landmarks rose in rapid succession: cinemas, service stations, factories, offices. Structures that in Europe might have taken decades to accumulate appeared within a few years. Giuseppe Pitazzi, among others, designed buildings that embraced modern materials while responding to local conditions: flat roofs, shaded porticos, and ventilation systems that acknowledged the Highland sun. The now famous cinema Impero, completed in 1937, embodied this fusion: sleek, monumental, and unmistakably modern, yet calibrated to its environment. These buildings were not isolated statements. They were embedded in an urban system that linked work, leisure, and administration. A cinema signaled cultural authority as much as entertainment. A service station celebrated mobility and mechanization, ideals central to fascist imagery. Factories and workshops reinforced the claim that Italy was bringing productive modernity, not merely governance, to Africa. The city was meant to be read as a total environment. Yet this freedom to innovate was inseparable from ideology. The city's modernism did not emerge from neutral curiosity. It was mobilized to serve a political narrative shaped by Benito Mussolini. The empire was presented as proof that fascism worked, that it could build faster, plan better, and impose order where others had failed. Asmara became a showcase not because of local demand, but because it fit this story precisely. The pace was relentless. Construction schedules tightened. Prefabricated elements and reinforced concrete allowed buildings to rise quickly. Urban plans were revised repeatedly to accommodate expansion rather than preservation. For Italian observers, this speed was a virtue, a visible sign of control. For Eritreans living in and around the city, it meant disruption layered on top of opportunity. Streets appeared where paths had been, jobs multiplied, but under conditions shaped by hierarchy and surveillance. What was striking, even at the time, was how little historical continuity the new architecture acknowledged. Unlike European cities weighed down by older styles, Asmara's modernism rarely referenced the past. That absence was intentional. Fascist aesthetics preferred rupture over evolution. The city was meant to look as though it had leapt forward, bypassing intermediate stages. Modernity was not gradual, it was delivered. By 1939, the transformation was visible and dense. Asmara had become one of the most concentrated ensembles of modernist architecture anywhere in the world. To visiting Italians, it appeared as a triumph, a city where ideology, technology, and urban form aligned. To colonial administrators, it was functional proof of control. The capital now looked the part it had been assigned, but this vision concealed its own fragility. The buildings spoke loudly, yet they did not explain the conditions under which they were made. Plans celebrated architects and styles, not labor. Photographs highlighted facades, not hands. The modern city projected confidence, but its foundations rested on systems rarely acknowledged in official narratives. Behind the concrete and glass stood thousands of Eritrean workers, skilled, semi-skilled, coerced, and underpaid, whose presence barely registered in celebratory accounts. The question lingered, unspoken but unavoidable: who actually built this modern city, and at what cost? A modern city rests on invisible hands. In Asmara's late 1930s boom, the speed and coherence of construction suggested effortless progress. Streets aligned, facades rose, utilities followed, yet the labor that made this possible remained largely absent from official photographs and architectural memoirs. Modernity appeared finished and self-contained, as though concrete had assembled itself, detached from the bodies that mixed it, carried it, and shaped it under pressure. The workforce was vast and unevenly documented. Eritrean men and women entered construction through multiple channels: waged employment, short-term contracts, and forms of coercion tied to colonial authority. Recruitment moved through village chiefs, labor offices, and administrative pressure that blurred the line between choice and obligation. Some workers sought the city for pay and stability during years of rural hardship. Others were compelled by quotas or taxation policies that made refusal difficult. Archival figures suggest sharp wage differentials, with Italian workers earning several times more for comparable tasks, and advancement constrained by race regardless of skill. Construction sites reflected the city's hierarchy in daily practice. Italians occupied supervisory roles: engineers, foremen, planners, while Eritreans performed most manual and skilled trades: masonry, carpentry, metalwork, road laying, and finishing. Training occurred on the job, often informally, producing a pool of artisans whose expertise would outlast the empire that employed them. Yet recognition did not follow competence. Credit accrued upward, anonymity settled downward. Finished buildings bore Italian names, not the marks of those who built them. Segregation shaped not only where people lived but how they worked and moved through the city. Zoning laws formalized separation between European quarters and indigenous districts, dictating access to services and proximity to employment. Italian neighborhoods received paved roads, lighting, and sanitation first. Eritrean areas lagged, often deliberately. The daily commute became an enactment of policy. Movement across the city traced lines of permission and exclusion, reinforced by police checks and informal enforcement. This separation extended into social life. Cafes, cinemas, and clubs advertised modern leisure while enforcing racial boundaries. Even spaces celebrated as symbols of progress functioned as filters: who could enter, who could linger, who could be seen. Architecture did not merely house ideology, it choreographed it. The city taught lessons without words, embedding hierarchy into routine. Silence followed. Official publications praised efficiency and style, rarely mentioning labor conditions. When workers appeared, they were described collectively, stripped of individuality and voice. Accidents, fatigue, and disputes surfaced only sporadically in records, often reframed as administrative inconveniences rather than human cost. The city's story, as told by the colonial state, had little room for dissenting detail. Yet everyday experience complicated this narrative. Wages, though unequal, circulated in families and markets. Skills acquired on sites translated into independent work, repairs, extensions, informal construction. Eritreans adapted techniques introduced under colonial rule to local needs, blending imposed forms with practical knowledge. The modern city, even as it excluded, generated capacities that could not be fully controlled. Tension accumulated as the pace intensified. The late 1930s compressed schedules and expectations. Labor demands rose with the ambition of the plans. At the same time, political surveillance tightened. Colonial authority feared unrest as much as delay. Order was enforced not only through the police, but also through dependence on wages, permits, and access to space. Segregation also produced paradoxes. Italian quarters relied on Eritrean labor for maintenance, cleaning, and service, creating daily interdependence across forbidden lines. The city functioned because boundaries were crossed constantly, even as they were publicly affirmed. This contradiction, separation in principle, proximity in practice, defined Asmara's social rhythm. As the Ethiopian campaign concluded and the city reached its architectural peak, the imbalance became harder to ignore. Buildings stood finished. Relationships remained unequal. The modern capital projected permanence, but the system sustaining it was brittle, dependent on authority that could be withdrawn. Workers sensed this vulnerability, even if they could not name it. The city's confidence did not extend to its foundations. By 1940, war elsewhere began to intrude. Supplies tightened, attention shifted. The empire that had demanded speed now faced limits. When British forces advanced in 1941 and Italian rule collapsed, the question was not only political, it was practical. What happens to a city built rapidly for an empire that no longer exists, and to the people whose labor made it real? The answer would test whether Asmara's modernity was merely a facade of power, or an urban system capable of surviving the disappearance of its builder's flag. Buildings without builders, cities without empires. When British forces entered Asmara in April 1941, they did not arrive to demolish a symbol. They arrived to administer a place that already functioned. Italian rule ended abruptly, but the city it had imposed did not dissolve with it. Streets remained aligned, utilities still ran, offices waited to be occupied. Power changed hands faster than concrete could crack, revealing how much of the city's authority was embedded in structure rather than personnel. The British military administration approached Asmara with pragmatism rather than vision. There was no grand plan to preserve or erase fascist architecture. The priority was order, keeping services running, housing officials, and maintaining supply routes in a region newly exposed by war. Italian-built structures offered immediate solutions. Government buildings became offices, barracks housed new authorities, warehouses stored unfamiliar uniforms. The city's functionality outweighed its symbolism. This reuse was not an endorsement. Fascist insignia were removed where visible and ignored where inconvenient. Street names changed slowly, if at all. The city's modernism was treated as infrastructure rather than ideology. In this indifference lay a quiet continuity. By occupying what existed, the British inadvertently ensured their survival. Demolition required intent and resources. Reuse required neither. Italian civilians, once central to the city's social and economic life, departed in stages. Some left immediately, fearing reprisal or internment. Others remained temporarily under supervision, uncertain of their status and livelihood. As they went, apartments emptied and businesses closed, creating gaps that Eritreans moved to fill. The city's racial order loosened, not by decree but by absence. Boundaries blurred as necessity replaced regulation. Eritrean workers and residents became the city's custodians almost by default. Skilled artisans maintained buildings they had helped construct. Shopkeepers reopened spaces once restricted. Cinemas screened different films for different audiences. The architecture remained recognizable, but its social choreography shifted. Without an empire to perform for, buildings became tools again, used, adapted, and occasionally neglected. Administrative uncertainty defined the next 2 decades. In 1952, Eritrea was federated with Ethiopia, a compromise shaped by international pressure rather than local consensus. Asmara retained its urban form but acquired new political meanings. Federal institutions occupied colonial offices. Later, when annexation followed in 1962, the city became a provincial capital within a larger state, its architectural distinctiveness increasingly peripheral to central authority. Neglect replaced spectacle, resources flowed elsewhere. Maintenance occurred unevenly, driven by use rather than preservation policy. This neglect, paradoxically, protected Asmara from the aggressive redevelopment that transformed many post-colonial cities. Modernist buildings survived not because they were cherished, but because they were adequate and affordable to keep standing. Everyday life adapted quietly. Apartments designed for Italian families housed Eritrean households. Offices became schools. Workshops expanded into former garages. The city's grid absorbed these changes with minimal strain. Its planning, imposed for control, proved flexible in practice. Architecture outlasted ideology by being useful. Memory, however, remained unsettled. For some, the buildings recalled coercion and exclusion. For others, they represented stability amid political upheaval. These interpretations coexisted without resolution. The city did not demand agreement. It demanded care. Leaking roofs and cracked pavements were problems regardless of symbolism. The British period ended without ceremony. leaving behind records rather than monuments. Ethiopian rule brought its own pressures: centralization, suspicion of difference, and uneven investment. Yet Asmara's core endured. The city neither reverted to a pre-colonial state nor transformed into a new nationalist showcase. It persisted as an inherited system, shaped by hands more than slogans. By the late 1960s, armed struggle began to reshape Eritrea's future. As conflict spread, Asmara's role shifted again. It became a place of relative calm compared to rural battle zones, a city of refuge, administration and survival. Its buildings sheltered offices, families, and routines that continued despite uncertainty. War passed through the city more than it passed around it, reinforcing continuity over rupture. This survival was not passive. Residents maintained, repaired and repurposed structures with limited resources. Cement patches replaced original finishes. Improvised wiring extended utilities. These acts altered facades and interiors, embedding new layers of history. The city's appearance remained modernist, but its substance grew local. By the time independence forces entered Asmara in 1991, the city was neither a colonial relic nor a nationalist creation. It was lived in, adapted, and claimed through use rather than proclamation. The architecture had endured regime change by shedding its original authorship. What remained was a question deferred rather than answered. How would independence reframe this inherited city, preserve it, politicize it, or finally redefine its meaning? The answer would not arrive immediately, but the ground had shifted. For the first time, Asmara's future would be negotiated not between empires, but among those who had lived with its buildings all along. Architecture that refuses to become a museum. From the 1960s through independence in 1991, Asmara's Italian-built cityscape endured not because it was curated, but because it was lived in. The buildings remained open to wear, repair, and improvisation. They did not freeze into symbols, they absorbed daily use. Their survival depended less on ideology than on routine, on doors opening, offices functioning, and families adapting spaces to fit changing needs. As Eritrea's long war for independence unfolded, Asmara occupied a complex position. It was a city largely spared from sustained fighting, yet never detached from conflict. Administration, commerce, and family life continued under pressure, shaped by shortages, surveillance, and uncertainty. The modernist buildings, offices, cinemas, workshops, apartments offered shelter and continuity. Their value was measured more by reliability than by origin. Walls that stood and roofs that held mattered more than architectural pedigree. Everyday use quietly reshapes meaning. Former colonial offices hosted local bureaucracies and municipal services. Cinemas screened popular films, political gatherings, and community events. Service stations became informal repair hubs, adapting to scarcity by improvising tools and parts. Apartments designed for single European families accommodated extended Eritrean households. Interiors changed first, walls subdivided, kitchens expanded, balconies enclosed, while facades remained largely intact. The city looked the same. It lived differently. Maintenance during wartime was practical and uneven. Materials were scarce. Cement, wiring, and fixtures were reused or substituted. Skilled labor persisted, drawing on knowledge passed down from the original construction boom and refined through necessity. Repairs prioritized roofs, plumbing, and electrical connections over aesthetics. This pragmatism altered details, patched concrete, mismatched paint, but preserved structure. The absence of large-scale redevelopment spared Asmara the erasures seen in cities rebuilt through ideology or speculation. Importantly, this period did not romanticize hardship. Electricity cuts, water shortages, and economic constraints defined daily experience. Yet these conditions reinforced a utilitarian relationship with architecture. Buildings were not revered, they were relied upon. Their endurance came from usefulness, not nostalgia or deliberate preservation. Social boundaries also continued to soften. The rigid racial zoning of the colonial period no longer dictated access. Movement through the city followed work, family ties, and necessity, rather than ordinance. Public spaces became shared by default. The architecture, once designed to separate, now facilitates proximity and overlap. Memory remained fragmented. For older residents, buildings recalled exclusion and control. For younger generations, they were simply the city as known. Schools attended, films watched, streets crossed. These memories overlapped without settling into a single narrative. The city accommodated contradiction by functioning. As independence approached, Asmara entered a new phase of anticipation. The inherited city posed a dilemma. whether to mark a clear break with colonial forms or to continue adapting them. No immediate decision resolved this tension. Instead, continuity prevailed. The city had survived by use. It would enter independence the same way. By 1991, when Eritrean forces entered Asmara, the architecture stood neither triumphant nor disgraced. It stood occupied. The buildings had outlasted their makers by becoming ordinary, and in that ordinariness lay a question that independence would soon bring into sharper focus. When a city has been lived in long enough, who owns its meaning, and who decides what should be preserved? When the world names what locals already live in, recognition becomes negotiation. After independence in 1991, Asmara entered a period of reassessment, not only of sovereignty but of inheritance. The city's modernist fabric, long maintained through habit rather than policy, now faced a different kind of attention. Preservation shifted from something implicit and informal to something debated, regulated, and externally visible. The early post-independence years prioritized recovery and governance. Resources were limited. Housing, infrastructure, healthcare, and administration demanded focus. In this context, Asmara's Italian-era buildings continued to be used much as before. Offices remained offices. Apartments remained homes. There was no immediate campaign to monumentalize the past. The city's value lay in what it enabled day to day, not what it symbolized historically. Gradually, however, international interest grew. Architects, historians, and urban planners began to frame Asmara as exceptional, a rare, largely intact modernist city in Africa, preserved not by design but by circumstance. Academic studies circulated, conferences referenced the city as an anomaly. What had long been ordinary locally was becoming remarkable globally. This shift altered how Asmara was spoken about, even before any formal designation. That attention culminated in a nomination process that reframed the city in a new language: heritage, integrity, authenticity. The inscription of Asmara as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2017 formalized this shift. The city was recognized not as a collection of isolated landmarks but as an urban ensemble: streets, buildings, infrastructure functioning together. International criteria emphasized coherence and survival across time. The modernist city was now something to be protected, rather than simply used. For many residents, this recognition brought mixed reactions. Pride sat alongside unease. Preservation promised visibility, expertise, and potential resources. It also introduced new rules. Conservation guidelines raised questions about change, what repairs were acceptable, which alterations threatened integrity, and whose standards applied. A city shaped by adaptation now faced limits imposed in the name of safeguarding. These tensions were practical as much as philosophical. Buildings still housed offices, shops, and families. Maintenance required modification, new wiring, plumbing, accessibility and safety measures, conservation frameworks by design, slow change. Daily life by necessity does not. Negotiating between these rhythms became the central challenge of the heritage era. Local authorities approached preservation with caution rather than celebration. The goal was not to fossilize the city, but to stabilize it. Policies emphasized continued use, recognizing that abandonment would be the greatest threat. Yet balancing international expectations with domestic needs proved complex. Funding arrived unevenly. Expertise traveled faster than materials. Decisions were often incremental, shaped by constraint rather than vision. The debate unfolded quietly rather than publicly. Asmara lacked the visible clashes seen in cities where heritage designation drives displacement or tourism pressure. Still, questions circulated: whose memory was being preserved? Was the modernist city being framed primarily as an Italian achievement, an Eritrean inheritance, or a neutral artifact of history? Language mattered, emphasis mattered. Importantly, the narrative resisted a rescue framing. The city had not survived because outsiders intervened. It had survived because residents maintained it through decades of uncertainty. World Heritage recognition acknowledged endurance, but it also risked recasting agency, shifting credit from lived practice to institutional designation. Conservation introduced new forms of visibility. Buildings once taken for granted were photographed, catalogued, and measured. This attention altered perception. What had been background became foreground. For some, this reinforced pride. For others, it introduced distance, as though familiar streets were being reinterpreted for an external audience. Yet the process also clarified the stakes. Preservation was no longer abstract. Decisions about paint colors, window frames, signage, and materials carried symbolic weight. Small changes signaled alignment or resistance. the city became a site of quiet negotiation between continuity and control. By the late 2010s, Asmara stood at a crossroads. Recognition had secured its place in global narratives of modernism. At the same time, it intensified the question of ownership. Heritage status did not answer who should decide the city's future. It made the question unavoidable. As debates settled into routine, one uncertainty remained unresolved. Could Asmara remain a living city while being treated as a world treasure, or would preservation, however well-intentioned, begin to prioritize memory over life? The answer would not come from declarations or plaques, but from how the city continued to function day after day under the weight of global attention. A city that remembers by functioning. In Asmara today, memory is not fixed to plaques or confined to guided routes. It circulates through doors that open each morning, through stairwells worn smooth by decades of use, through buildings that continue to do what they were adapted to do long after their original purpose faded. The city's past is encountered not as a lesson but as an environment, entered repeatedly, often without ceremony. The Italian-built cityscape no longer belongs to a single story. It is neither a monument to fascist ambition nor a neutral backdrop stripped of history. It operates instead as a working inheritance, an urban system shaped by power but sustained by people. In this sense, Asmara resists simple moral sorting. Its architecture does not demand admiration or rejection. It demands engagement, maintenance, and choice. For residents, the buildings are tools. Offices must function. Homes must shelter. Shops must open. This practical relationship places limits on symbolism. A facade may carry traces of an imposed past, but a leaking roof demands repair regardless of ideology. By prioritizing use, Eritreans have asserted agency not through renaming every structure or erasing every trace, but through deciding how space is inhabited, adapted, and passed on. This approach reframes ownership. The city's meaning is not frozen at the moment of construction or inscription. It accumulates through repetition, each repair, each adaptation, each generation that uses space differently. Control over memory emerges not from erasure, but from continuity under new terms. The past is neither sealed nor allowed to dominate. It is carried forward in altered form. Asmara's case complicates broader debates about post-colonial cities, where some argue for demolition as justice and others for preservation as reconciliation. Asmara demonstrates a third path. Architecture can be retained without reverence, maintained without nostalgia. The city shows that endurance itself can be a form of response, one that neither forgets nor glorifies. This does not resolve every tension. Inequality persists. Resources remain constrained. Preservation rules continue to shape choices. But the city's endurance suggests that meaning is negotiated daily, not decided once and for all. Memory here is active, not commemorative. It is shaped by routine rather than ritual. In the end, Asmara's buildings do not speak for themselves. They are spoken through by those who walk their corridors, repair their cracks, and repurpose their rooms. The city remembers because it is used, and in that use, its inhabitants have claimed something quieter and more durable than symbolism, the right to decide what inherited stone is allowed to become. Asmara does not ask to be admired, it asks to be understood. Its buildings were conceived as statements of power, drawn quickly, built decisively, and meant to endure beyond the moment that gave them life. But history did not stop when the architects left. Empires fell, administrations changed, wars passed nearby, and still the city remained. Repaired, adapted, inhabited. What gives Asmara its meaning today is not the ideology that shaped its streets, but the people who continued to live within them. They neither erased the past nor surrendered to it. Instead, they carried it forward, quietly, practically, turning imposed forms into everyday spaces. This is what memory looks like when it is used rather than displayed. When buildings are not frozen as symbols but allowed to age alongside those who depend on them. When inheritance is not chosen but claimed through care. Asmara's architecture survives not because it was protected from history, but because it endured it. And in that endurance lies its true legacy, not of empire, but of continuity. History like this survives through attention, like the video to support long-form documentary storytelling. Share it with someone interested in cities, memory, and overlooked histories. Comment with your thoughts on Asmara's future, and subscribe for more deeply researched historical films.